I'm Liz White, a member of the Author Selection Committee, and I have the great honor of introducing to you Tania James, author of the current bestseller, Loot. Loot is a... Yes, they've read your book. Loot is a lively and really symbolically rich novel, and it's set in the 18th century. The story covers 3 countries, India, England, and France. And it has centered around 3 characters: a teenage Indian toy maker, a legendary French clockmaker, and a woman of interest. But the true centerpiece of the story is an extraordinary automaton. Picture this, a 6-foot large wooden tiger gnawing the throat of a prone English soldier. And when the crank is turned, the arms of the soldier go up and down, and you hear sounds of growling and moaning. This curious automaton actually exists, and it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It was commissioned in the 1790s by Tipu Sultan, a South Indian ruler, and it is one of the museum's most popular and famous objects. And note, the Indian automaton is in a British museum. This gives you one clue to the book's title, Loot. In this dazzling novel, James imagines the circumstances of the creation and the exchange of ownership of this automaton. And through this lens, she captures the excitement of artistic achievement, as well as the adverse effects of the plunders of war and colonialism. Loot also includes high adventure and a love story, told with exuberant and witty prose. The novel is at once swashbuckling and searing, quite an achievement. James has completed 4 works of fiction, and she is a professor in the MFA program at George Mason University. Please welcome Tania James.
Hi, everybody. People have been asking me if I'm nervous, and I'm like, no, it's easy. Because I feel like if I just keep saying I'm not nervous, I won't be nervous. So I'm just going to confess that I have been lying this whole morning. I'm nervous. I thought before I start my talk, I just want to say that I wanted to talk about Mrs. Dalloway. I teach at George Mason University. I have something of a reputation there for mentioning Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf on a weekly basis. And I'm not teaching this week, so I have to maintain that reputation by mentioning Mrs. Dalloway again. Mrs. Dalloway opens with what appears to be a trivial woman with a trivial mission, which is to throw a party. And one amazing thing about the novel is that it shows us that hosting a party is just as much an art form as painting or writing or any of the other things that we honor as art. But because party throwing is of the domestic sphere, we sort of dismiss it or don't treat it as art, or the work that goes into it is invisible. But in the weeks that have preceded this event, I've witnessed, just barely witnessed, the spontaneity and creativity and dedication of these organizers of the PFWA who fought to make this massive gathering happen. And I'm reminded that what they have done is an act of creation, and it is astonishing. And so I just want to take another moment, because every time I thank them, they just sort of say, no, it's about you. But I feel like there should be a moment to just acknowledge and thank everyone who has worked to create and sustain this living work of art, and all of you for being here. So thank you. Should I tilt it down? Okay. Ooh. I'm a little shorter than others. Okay. So, speaking of works of art, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my first foray into art, which was through dance. One summer, when I was 7, my mother informed me that my older sister and I would be enrolling in dance class. I was thrilled. I loved throwing myself into interpretive routines whenever my father put on the Top Gun soundtrack album, which he listened to from his recliner. Many years later, when I asked him what he thought of our dancing, he said, sort of quizzically, "That was dancing?" My sister and I got off to a rocky start with ballet and jazz. Being short, I could barely get my leg up on the lower bar without my hip cocking upwards. I hated doing drills across the floor. It was agonizing, watching the other girls perform light cat-like leaps. My sister was okay, graceful at least. I leapt like a wounded animal. But then, my sister and I discovered tap dance and something else. We were actually good at it. Our taps were clean, even when the rest of the class was falling into a muddled clatter. We were always on beat, always aligned with one another. And so it was that our teacher decided to repackage us into a tap duet with our own routines. Other duos and trios had flashy names like Spice or Flair or Dancing Divas. Using absolutely no imagination at all, our teacher dubbed us the James Sisters. It never occurred to us to ask for a different name or to come up with our own. Was this because we were Indian girls growing up in Kentucky, prone to thinking we should never rock the boat? Or was it because we were soft-spoken kids, cautious in the company of anyone who wasn't our own? Whatever the case, we didn't even think to voice an opinion about our costumes. Costume day was the day I dreaded most. During that class, our teacher called us up one by one to wrap a measuring tape around our busts, bellies, and butts, and muttered the measurements just loud enough to be heard by all before recording them in her notebook. Meanwhile, everyone else paged through the costume catalog, marveling at all the sequins and spangles. I prayed in vain for a skirt set or a culotte that would cover my butt, knowing I'd probably end up in a sequined leotard and the sort of shrunken vest an organ monkey might wear. After one particularly grim costume day, wherein my teacher discreetly suggested I start eating salads, I sulked in the waiting room. Our mother was late to pick us up. My sister was devouring a wrinkly People magazine, probably learning all the ways in which celebrities were just like us. I didn't even have the heart to fight her for it. A girl from my class, Megan, scooted to the chair next to mine and quietly asked if I wanted to see something. I was surprised at being addressed. None of the other dance girls ever spoke to my sister or me, a silence that induced the same in us. Megan opened a 2-pocket folder and removed a sheet of wide-ruled paper filled with her own handwriting. It was a story she had written herself, titled The Highway, and told from the perspective of a highway. Sometimes I get rough and bumpy, it read, but every 7 to 10 years I get a facial that makes me fresh and smooth. It's called being paved. The folder had several more of these monologues, each from the perspective of a different inanimate object. A depressed tennis racket with a broken string, a pencil sharpener constipated with shavings. I, who had read my share of Babysitter's Club books, had never encountered something of such sheer inventive genius. I was impressed. These stories were so creative, so free. Every day I witness that same freedom in my sons. In a blink, my older son teleports to the state of play, to imagined worlds of wizards and trolls. He's inside what he calls the game, which often extends to bedtime when I'm begging him to go to sleep and stop muttering to himself. His response is, "But the game never ends." What I wouldn't give to be able to drop down into that play state the minute I sit down to write, to enter the room where there are no wrong answers, as a student put it to me recently. The thing about children is that they tend to have an outsized level of creative confidence. I, as a child, had much of the same, but when I encountered Megan's highway story, something different flared in me. A singular thought, not just, I want to do that, but I want to have done that. The latter is a covetous feeling, which my Catholic schooling had told me was a bad thing. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, says the 10th commandment, nor your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. But what about coveting your friend's stories? Was that a gray area? And in reality, I didn't really covet the story itself. What I coveted boiled down to this notion: I want to do unto others what this story has done unto me. I have a friend, let's call him Michael, who discovered his life's purpose at the age of 15 when he came across two people playing capoeira. If you've ever seen capoeira, you know it to be both dance and martial art, graceful and powerful. After the match, Michael went up to one of the players, a capoeira maestre, and said, I want what you have. Hearing that line, I couldn't help but pull it into my own novel, Lute, which is on one level about the makers of an 18th century automaton that does exist, and on another level is about the hunger and ambition of the young artist, who, for the first time in his life, glimpses a different trajectory, possibilities he would never have seen otherwise without the influence of his mentor. The automaton at the center of Lute, called Tipu's tiger, is a fascinating object, a 6-foot-long wooden tiger that's mauling the throat of an English soldier. And I found myself obsessed with the automaton, but the obsession alone couldn't sustain me during the duration of writing a novel. Part of the project was in searching for my own self within the automaton, asking of myself, where am I in this? It's a question with no end that keeps reverberating throughout the course of the novel. At one point, I found myself writing a diary from the perspective of an English sailor on an East India Company ship. Initially, I was daunted by the prospect of inhabiting a mariner's perspective when I can't even swim half a lap without getting winded. But in one of the sailor's diary entries, I gave him one of my own childhood memories of when my mother would send me down to the basement to get something for her, and I would call her name with every stair step, desperate for reassurance. For the sailor, I changed basement to potato cellar, but the essential fear of the dark was the same. And suddenly there he was on the page, a living, breathing presence. I had similar misgivings about writing from the perspective of a woodcarver, as I know very little about wood carving. I am not good with knives and give myself tiny injuries every few days from cutting onions. And as a side note, I was once a Cutco knife salesperson, and in the midst of my first knife demo, I had to stop the presentation because I was bleeding so profusely from a self-inflicted wound. But I do know something about the longing, the desire, the drive that animates a young artist who doesn't yet know what her limitations might be, who sees only infinite possibility. As a young writer, I misunderstood the artist's lifelong and necessary relationship to failure, which is not to say that I wasn't well acquainted with failure. I simply thought that by book 3, book 4, the stories would be rolling out of me easily, that time would have granted me an authority over the stories I wanted to tell. And for a while, that theory held out. I published 3 books of fiction, each one 3 years apart, and I considered myself a decisive writer. Once I had an idea, I saw it through. And then I had kids. My productivity slowed dramatically, which I can't really blame on the fact that I had less time. Even after I had childcare, even after I had time in which to write, I found that what I wrote was as flat as the screen on which I typed it. I drafted 3 different novels, shelved them all. Nothing could save them, not even changing the font to Garamond. I think that for me, a novel is sort of a portrait of who I am at a particular point in time. This makes it difficult for me to return to a very old draft of a novel. It almost feels estranged from who I am in the present. This also means that a novel project is in some ways a race against my changing self. So perhaps that's why I kept failing creatively in the immediate aftermath of my children. I was becoming maybe too many different selves. I was morphing at warp speed. When people ask me what inspired Lute, I always cite Tipu's tiger. But the truth is the internal conditions and external conditions were in alignment. I was the person I needed to be in order to approach that beast, not the automaton, but the story itself. Beast seems the right word for a work in progress, not only because it is alive, but because it is wily and unpredictable and inviting and annoying, and it allows for moments of joy. By joy, I don't mean happiness. I mean that which banishes my ego, that trains my attention on something so acutely I forget my ambitions, my very self. That is joy. Joy requires patience, and I can think of no one more patient than my grandmother, whom I called Ammachi. She died at the age of 100. She came from a long line of Syrian Christian women who wore the same outfit every single day, what's called chatanmunda, a plain white blouse over plain white sarong, pleated in the back. How she daily kept that outfit so spotless white, I do not know. It was certainly not for lack of work to do, raising 7 children and more grandchildren than I can count. When she was 88 years old and released from the responsibilities of caring for others, she did something extraordinary. She began to paint. Her first subjects were orchids, watercolor orchids, over and over in fuchsia, purple, blue, and all the hues she never wore. When my brother-in-law got her a book of bird photographs, she moved on to parrots and owls and cranes. She painted for hours and through meals, ignoring my mother, who was hollering from the kitchen, begging her to come down and eat something, eat and then go back to painting. But Ammachi stayed upstairs for lengthening stretches, nourished in a new way. All her life she had been tethered to the work of the home, all while the artist within was biding her time until not yet became now. When she showed me her first orchid painting, I asked her to sign it. She'd signed one of her sketches for me before, but she'd signed it Ammachi, which is the Malayalam term for mother, the name we all called her. For the orchid, I told her to sign her name, Rachel Kurian. She was shy about it at first. She must have thought it silly or maybe egotistical, signing her name like that. After all, we knew who had created that painting. To write Rachel Kurian suggested an audience beyond the ones that knew her. But without my prompting, she signed every painting afterward with her name, first and last, not the title that had defined most of her life in relation to others. The makers of Tipu's tiger appear nowhere on the automaton itself. During my research, I never found their names or any details about them, beyond the speculation that the internal mechanics were French and the exterior was local in style. In my novel, I give them names. In my novel, someone discovers their names carved into the inside of the automaton. When I wrote this moment, I was thinking of the abbey at Mont Saint-Michel off the coast of Normandy, which I visited in the early phases of writing the novel. In one room of the abbey, the floor was made up of large cubical stones. In the corner of each stone were the initials of the people who had carved it. Everywhere else, the stones had been laid with those sides facing inward, so as to hide these initials. But in this room, for some reason, the stoneworkers had decided not to omit themselves from history. This was as wondrous to me as the abbey itself. this very human desire to be seen, to be recognized, to be known. I hope readers will come away from my book with a similar sense of wonder and enchantment, the same wonder with which I look at the paintings of Rachel Goodin. When I look at them now, with her 3 months gone from this world, I'm reminded of the note of genuine surprise in her voice as she told me, "I didn't know I could do that." For so many years, she had no idea of what she would channel into being. And neither, dear readers and fellow writers and artists of all stripes, do you. I wish you decades of discovery and joy and play, and my greatest wish for you, for all of us, boils down to this: may the game never end. Thank you.
Describe to us your first reaction when you first saw the wooden tiger, and was it at the British Museum?
No, I think I saw it in a book. No, not even in a book. I was reading a book about automatons, and I went down a rabbit hole about automatons, and I saw a small picture online, and I just thought, I have never seen a work of art done by the colonized and looking at the imperial power. And this, I mean, technically they weren't colonized yet, but this sort of critique of imperial power, and it just seemed to me completely unlike anything I'd seen before. And my initial response probably was, I want to know more. And I quickly came up against a wall of, I can't find out very much about it. And so there was a sort of period of how much can I imagine? How should I be taking this much creative liberty? And so, I had certain sort of hesitations or reluctance at first about trying to bring this into historical fiction. But over time, I sort of it sort of ran off. The story kind of took off in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. What was the most surprising historical fact you learned over the course of doing research for the book?
Oh, gosh. The thing about me is when I do research for historical fiction, this is my first historical fiction, is that the information goes in and immediately out. And it's just, I just use the research I need in order to write the book itself. But I will say that, this is probably not that, maybe some of you know this already, but the title Loot, I had no idea that the word actually is Sanskritic in origin, and that the word lutna in Hindi means to plunder. And that it entered the English language around this time, around the late 1700s. And I just love that. That's one thing I love, is hearing words that I assume to be from Germanic or European languages, but they actually, like the word cash comes from Sanskrit cash. And I just love discovering these things, and because it just seems to me the word loot then becomes a stand-in for the movement not only of things but of language and words and people. And I just to me that was one of those things where I discovered it early, and I just knew that this is going to be the title.
Okay. Yeah. In Loot, colonial British powers take the tiger, and India wants it back. Many museums today are wrestling with this question: who should own an object? To whom does art really belong? Did writing your book give you any insight into the answers to that question?
I've even over the course of my book tour, I've changed my mind about things a lot. I mean, the truth is every object has its own sort of context, and I find myself feeling that the process of writing the novel has led me to feel less attached to this idea that I need to have the answer for that question, and that I, as a novelist, am interested in asking these questions a different way, or sort of addressing the possibility of speaking back to history in a bold way, in a confrontational way, and sort of rather than this binary question of is restitution the way to go, or are these museums wrong or right? I am interested in opening up a space where we can we can sort of, rather than ignore history or speak about this sort of plunder in a kind of passive voice way, rather than sort of answering yes or no, can artists, contemporary artists, visual artists, writers, sort of really look closely at the way in which history sort of distorts other stories that don't get spoken about. And so there are visual artists that I really love and who inspired me a lot in the way that they are already doing that, like Titus Kaphar, who you might know this painting. He has a presidential portrait of what looks like Thomas Jefferson, but that portrait, that canvas is being pulled to the side, and you can see what appears to be a black enslaved woman who's looking directly at the viewer. And so this is just another way of sort of opening up this space and like trying to think more creatively as a response to history, I think.
Thank you. Were there any particular themes you wanted to make sure that the book explored and your readers engaged with?
I mean, I don't know that I think about themes so much in the early stages. I know that people kind of extract what they will based on their own their lives and journeys, but I would say the sort of theme that kind of meant the most to me was the sort of the beautiful side of ambition, but also the sort of corrosive side of ambition in terms of becoming an artist, and the ways in which an artist sort of sometimes may feel as though they need to choose between community and solitude. And that sort of tension, I think, is something I think about a lot as a writer even now.
So I understand you wrote Loot during the pandemic while teaching and being a mom. How did that go?
It went great. I hear this a lot from other writers who wrote. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us who are here, the other authors who are here with have wrote their novels during the pandemic too. I mean, I think that also, I didn't mention this, but part of the reason I think those other novels failed that I was writing, that I think they weren't, I needed some source of delight and some source of kind of adventure. And so it was really important to me that the novel provide that for me, and I think it was a kind of refuge, and which sounds weird, like that a novel that is largely about colonialism is a delight, but it kind of was, and I deploying humor in some way or speaking about colonialism with an eye to the absurd, that helped to kind of leaven and lighten the situation. But for me it was definitely now that I don't have a novel I'm working on, I just look at that time and that sort of secure space so warmly, and I hope it will return. We'll see. Yeah.
So here's your last question. This is a room of readers. What are you reading now?
Ooh, what am I reading now? Oh, I just started, the novel it's not a novel, it's a work of nonfiction I just finished, was Kick the Latch by Catherine Scanlon, and it's about a horse trainer. It's amazing. And the novel I just started was Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.